Hello guys. So today's workshop, the workshop is set to run. It's about CSS, SCSS, which is basically Sass. This stands for like syntactic alias and style sheets. And it's basically a CSS extension or a preprocessor, um, which basically gets compiled to traditional CSS. Setting it up for on Create React App is pretty simple using just a package. I've never had any I've never found it any simpler to install Sass or compile Sass. I think we're all familiar with npm install. Let me just check I'm on the right. Yeah, it's pretty much really simple. It's like npm install node Sass. That will basically install a package, and all you have to do is just um, rename every CSS file to SCSS, like you can see here. And then once you go into your app.js, you just basically change that. But we'll see that in practice in a minute. I'm just going to write the steps here. I can send it to you till the package gets installed. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Just because it's a bit slow here, I'm not sure. I thought it might have issues with the connection. Change. Never made. I tested it yesterday. It wasn't as long, so let's give it a couple of more seconds. All right, there you go. All good. Um, so now we should have the package installed. If we would check our package.json, um, we can see there's a node Sass. Then that should be pretty simple to kind of go and update. Let's base CSS empty. Oh, just going to change this. I'm just going to get the console up so you can see. Ooh. All right, so basically that's complaining because the reference is not there, if I'm right. Yeah. I was just checking on the wrong file. So that should solve the problem. Let me get my app up so we can actually see that everything kind of looks normal. There you go, still runs. Am I just going to maybe landing page and kind of show you what things could be used, um, and talk about more about CSS? Because like basically it's really powerful tool. It enables you to kind of like use variables, nested rules, imports, loops, functions. Um, it's really powerful. Um, as to start with, I thought I might just kind of create a couple of things to show you as we go along. I think we discussed this yesterday with Adam about how you can reuse classes and how you can componentize things. Um, And Sass kind of gives you the opportunity to have mixins, which basically is like you break things down into smaller chunks and then like reference them like we can see below. Um, I think this code all makes sense to everyone. But what I'll do, rather than just go into like switching tabs, I will just use the online compiler so you can see how simple that is. So just to explain to you, so like when you run mixins, you can give you can pass parameters next to your buttons. It's not just like breaking things into reusable components, but also about passing, let's say, variables, something you can go and update depending on the case. As when using mixins, you have to always start with add include, the name of the mixin, and if there is any variable, you just pass it, like in this case, color and the text. And as we can see, it gets compiled into what I actually had in my editor. And that's the reason I kind of think this is a really powerful tool is just because you can identify patterns that you reuse in your app and just go and create all these small buttons, let's say. Bear in mind, like it's like a really interesting feature of it is the import, which I am using in here. So for example, I created like my main SCSS and I can have mixins, extends, you can break things down, like you can have like hundreds of imports here. And that makes your style sheets smaller and easier to manage. Because as we kind of like know already from like we componentize things. And just imagine having an app.css file, which is endless. It makes things easy to go and like, whilst working with SCSS, I went on holidays, for example, and went back after a few weeks, and I know exactly where everything stands because you can name your style sheets and you know exactly where to look. You don't have to scroll up and down into long CSS files. Part of in my portfolio, I decided to do something that I could share with you in terms of the variables and maps. So like I said earlier, you can create variables. To create variables, you need a $sign, the name of the variable, and whatever the value is. That can be a color, it can be a media query, it can be something that you will end up reusing in your application. But also SCSS can let you create maps, which maps look something like this. The reason it's good to create maps sometimes, especially when it comes to colors or media queries, is that you can loop through them by using for or while. I think we all familiar with this idea of having maps and how we iterate, and then which basically the syntax looks something like this. For each color in my map, do this, which is basically you give the name of the class, and basically this is this is syntax that is written in the Sass documentation. Check this interpolation out. I think we're all familiar with the square brackets, the curly brackets. Sass is really good. This is really really good documented from books to tutorials. Everything you want to find, you can become a pro. I believe you can become a pro by just checking what's available online. And another problem we kind of like, I think I'm just kind of touching upon cases that we discussed in the group, for example, when like Adam suggested to Dan to go and like namespace his styles. This is something that we can solve with Sass, because you can have nested, uh, you can have nested, you can nest things basically. And what I mean with that, like once you create a project, for example, in this case, once you create a project or item, and then you can have everything that comes under this component or block of code inside Sass, inside the, like, let's say project item, and then once it gets compiled, is already namespaced. But you don't have to worry about compiling, because using this package, Sass, Node Sass, it does all this for you. All you have to do is just change the file, like install it and change the file names. What you can also do is just keep your media queries together with, like basically keep your styles together. You don't have to worry about, oh, I will have this style sheet for my app and then this for my media queries, or you check for material card and then you have to scroll all the way down to find where like the media query is. You can actually keep everything together. So anyone can jump on your project and then can figure out what's going on. You don't have to kind of like ask questions and go back and forth. What else? What did that make sense? What I showed here? I could run a few more examples about extents or show you how loops work. Anyone else? No, no, no. Uh, I'm only using the compiler just to make things easy, like make things easier for you visually to see how it actually gets getting compiled. You don't in Back in the days, you needed a compiler, and then you had a CSS file, and then instead of your SCSS file, that was getting compiled into a CSS file that you have to reference in your index.js or index.html, whatever that was. It could get a bit complicated, a bit messy, and maybe like people didn't really know where to look. But my experience so far with Create React App is really simple. All you have to is just basically you using, like, check this out. I don't have I don't need to check any compiler. I've got this looks like CSS, right? I mean, I think we're all familiar with this, other than with the nesting. Um, so yeah, you don't have to worry about any compiler. The only reason I'm using it there is just to give you a bit of a context how things are, um, how things look. And I will run. So what I mentioned earlier, like you can use mixins, which basically mixins is like it's a code that you can later on go and apply some variables and adjust based on the application you use or the component you use. But also we have extents, which extents is things that they're like usually getting repeated without having, well, like your header, for example, without needing to change anything. And I will run this again. I'll run this example in the compiler. Bear in mind, like check the syntax. Extends start with @mixin. Mixin start with @mixin, and when get reference, add include. Whereas extends, which they don't require any sort of like logic in it. I mean, in terms of you don't pass any variable. is percentage, the name of your extent, and once you want to reference it, is add extent and whatever that is. So check this. For example, yeah, that one I'm not able to check in chat, but so this thing that look, of course, it looks really simple here, but you would normally go into creating my component dot title and then my app h2 in a different place, and like you don't really sometimes you don't really know what's going on. You kind of like it's hard to manage. You don't know what your headers are. So I think, for example, using this approach, it's easy to make things to standardize things and be consistent in your code. Um, Kind of like create a style sheet or a style guide, let's say, that everyone can pick up and follow. Like think about it as like breaking components into objects. Uh, like for example, you're able to reskin and retheme an application by just going and changing the variables. For example, if one day, um, like we saw in my portfolio, let's say I have all my colors, then one day we decide to change, like we rebrand and we decide to change the colors. All we have to do is just go and change variables. Um, like, of course, this in this case, these variables are like not really helpful because I just created colors, but I can, for example, in my something I've used in my material card, and should be here. So I'm using a ribbon and I've got some colors. If by like any time I want to go and change this, and I can actually be good if I showed you that, but that might take a bit of time to. I think like if you actually see this a bit more visually, it will make a bit more sense. Um, so I will park this for now, and I'll show you a couple of more examples on things that you could be doing using Sass. By any chance, like if you guys have any questions whilst I go through this, please interrupt me and like ask at the end. Okay. So my layout. So in my layout again, I've done kind of something. I've used four, which is one. So Sass has some modules, let's say, or functions that they're given already. They are defined, which they already have the syntax, and you can basically pick it up by day one. Just copy and paste things, and just rename your classes. Um, so what I did here, I decided to create some virtual columns, like we all know with flex basis. I've got my variable here, which basically my for loop, let's say, iterates through and just creates like 12 classes for me. Check how we're talking about like few lines of code. And if I compile this, it gets really messy. Like, sorry, oh, sorry, it's a bit slow. I feel your pain now, Ricardo. So let's compare this side of we're talking about 39 lines, and on the right side we have 243. So you can see how if I wanted to achieve the same thing writing CSS, it would take me a lot longer and harder to read and harder to find out what I'm looking for. Uh, yes, as I said, like you can spend weeks away from a project and go back and figure out things. I don't know. For me, it's like it's a gift to my. I think I would call it like a gift to your future self, and you're like you would save you a lot of time. So I'll finish. We finish off with the example that I said about the ribbons, and then I'll let you ask questions. There you go. It might be good if I get it side by side. You could easily argue like, oh yeah, it's just the same component, so it's easy to go and change it. But um, I think it's nice to kind of extract things in one place and knowing exactly what your styles are, like your key variables are and your key colors and everything. I hope all that made sense. Um, yeah, I'm ready for questions, I think. Yes, that one, right. Uh, how is it helpful? Let me, so I will inspect my codes. So what I did here, for example, how it's helpful is it helps me for consistency. So I know exactly how I've got a grid basically, right? Which um, there you go. I have flex, but I'm kind of creating a virtual grid inside it using that approach. So bear in mind, like we know about grid and we know about flex. When you use grid, you can specify one fragment or two fragments and kind of like give things equal spacing. Um, how I find it useful in my project in this case, since I'm using, as I say, I'm using flex, but I still have the grid embedded into it. I can go and change these classes and make it like if I want like a medium size, I want it to occupy 3 fragments, and the next one I want it to be 6, or it's just it's just easier to kind of like, especially when it comes to design, let's say, to be consistent. And I think I mentioned this earlier, like consistency is something that comes it like SCSS helps you with. I'm not sure if that answers your question or um, yeah. Um, I will try and use something that Ricardo says, for example, divide and conquer. But I wanted to mention this, um, and where I want to link it is where you can actually have your inputs. So breaking things down and divide your style sheet down and like make it into like manageable chunks. I think is a key. Back to the questions. Ricardo, you wanted to say something? Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Feels a bit more fun. That was yes. Yeah. 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 Yep. Likely. Yep. Yep. No. No. Uh, I've not. To be fair, I'm going to be honest. I've not compared, for example, using SCSS and CSS. I just imagine it to be the same though, because it's only one call. It's only one request. Um, but of course, I mean, today has been like really slow. Like I've never had any issue. For example, the last few weeks I've been working with Create React, and as I said at the beginning, it's I've never seen such a simple like way to actually use it. Um, in the past, you had to compile, change your references. You need a couple of packages to do this. It was different on Mac and different on Windows, whereas now it's like pretty simplified. Thank you. And yes. To start with, I think you cannot value and have power from day one, because if you know, I mean, we all been using CSS, for example, and we all know the rules. I mean, um, let me show you like some of my styles, and I think you will already be familiar with it. It's not something you've not really experienced before. And correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, like of course here I'm using variables, but I'm going to scroll up and say, I think we're all aware of this. We all know what this is. What's the only difference you have here is that you're just nesting things rather than like doing project item dot material card and then all the styles, and then go and do the same thing for H2, and like the rest of the styles, I can actually use this. Um, so it basically is nesting. Of course, it's something that I think something that worth mentioning is like we know for Java, for like JavaScript, let's say you shouldn't nest too many functions or too many like higher order functions. Don't go crazy and go down further down the tree. It's simple to kind of break things down into like, let's say your let's say containers, and just nest things down. Don't keep adding classes and classes. And I think one of the like this allows like helps you with shorter selectors, not really big like long rules and all that stuff. No over specificity issues you might have you might face in the future using CSS. I hope this answered your question. I mean, like as I said, like I believe you cannot buy you straight away. Is for me, at least, this is my honest opinion, like personal opinion. Is it's easier to read. It's easier to focus. Where like what is it, rather than start focusing on a long selector and trying to figure out where that selector is. Any more questions? Thank you, guys. I will share a few resources in Slack after the session, and if you have any questions, like ping me, and I'm happy to help you anytime, either to set it up or if you want to start using it. Thank you.